In the dust-choked town of Millfield, Oklahoma, 1885, a desperate young mother stands at the county auction with nothing left to sell but hope itself. Lila Monroe clutches the rope of her family's last milk cow, her pregnant belly pressing against her worn cotton dress, while her two young children watch from the wagon with hollow, hungry eyes. The cow represents their final lifeline. Without her milk, they'll starve before winter's end. The crowd murmurs as bidding begins, dust swirling round weathered boots and sun-beaten faces. Then a tall figure in polished leather steps forward. Grayson Vance, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, raises his hand with quiet authority. But instead of taking the cow after winning the bid, he does something that shocks everyone present. What happens next will change both their lives forever. But will it be enough to survive what's coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In Lila's hands, as she led Bessie away from the auction grounds, heavier somehow, weighted with questions she couldn't answer. The cow's bell chimed softly with each step, a sound that should have brought comfort, but instead echoed the confusion churning in her chest. Around them, the crowd dispersed with the satisfied murmur of deals made and business concluded, but Lila felt suspended between disbelief and desperate gratitude. "Mama, why did the man give Bessie back?" 8-year-old Emma walked beside the wagon, her bare feet kicking up small clouds of red dust. Her voice carried that particular blend of curiosity and wisdom that children develop when they've seen too much hardship too young. Lila glanced down at her daughter, noting how the girl's dress hung loose on her thin frame, how her brown hair had grown shaggy without proper scissors to trim it. "I don't rightly know, sweetheart. Sometimes people do kind things without expecting anything back." Even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her. In her 26 years, especially the 3 since Robert's death, she'd learned that kindness rarely came without strings attached. Men didn't hand over $50 and walk away, not in times like these, when every family counted their pennies twice. 5-year-old Samuel bounced in the wagon bed, his energy a stark contrast to his sister's solemnity. "Is he gonna be our friend, Mama? He had nice boots." The memory of Grayson Vance's polished leather boots brought back the entire scene with painful clarity. The way he'd stepped forward without hesitation, his quiet authority parting the crowd like Moses at the Red Sea. His voice, deep and steady, calling out his bid with the casual confidence of a man who'd never wondered where his next meal would come from. And then, most puzzling of all, the way he'd looked at her when he placed Bessie's rope back in her trembling hands. "We'll see about that, Samuel," she murmured, one hand instinctively moving to rest on her swollen belly. The baby kicked, as if responding to her unease. Their homestead appeared as they crested the small hill, and Lila's heart clenched at the sight. What had once been Robert's pride looked more like a scar on the landscape now. The house, built with such hope 5 years ago, sagged under the weight of deferred repairs. Shingles hung askew. The front porch steps had developed a dangerous lean, and the vegetable garden that had once fed them through the seasons had withered to brown stubble. She remembered the day they'd broken ground, Robert's strong hands guiding the plow while she followed behind, planting seeds and dreaming of the children who would run through these fields. He'd promised her they'd make something lasting here, something to pass down through generations. Now the land seemed to mock those dreams, with its barren patches and broken fences. "Mama, look." Emma pointed toward their front door, and Lila's blood chilled. A white paper was tacked to the weathered wood, official and ominous against the faded paint. She helped the children down from the wagon and approached the notice with leaden feet. The words swam before her eyes. "Final notice of eviction," in bold black letters at the top, followed by legal language that boiled down to a simple, devastating truth. 30 days. They had 30 days before the bank would seize the property. For unpaid debts, Lila sank onto the porch steps, the notice crumpling in her fist. How had it come to this so quickly? She'd managed to make partial payments, had pleaded with Mr. Henderson at the bank just last month for more time. But apparently, partial payments weren't enough anymore. "Mama, what's wrong?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. She looked up to find both children watching her with those wide, worried eyes that had become too familiar. They'd learned to read her moods, to gauge their security by the set of her shoulders and the lines around her eyes. The weight of being their only protection, their only source of comfort and provision, settled over her like a heavy quilt on a summer day. "Nothing that can't be fixed," she lied, forcing a smile that felt like cracked plaster. "Let's get Bessie settled and see about some supper." But as she led the cow to their makeshift shelter, her mind kept returning to Grayson Vance and his inexplicable act of kindness. Perhaps it hadn't been kindness at all, but pity. The thought stung worse than gratitude would have. Either way, she was still alone, still pregnant, still watching her children grow thinner each day, while she counted coins that never seemed to multiply, no matter how carefully she stretched them. Grayson Vance stood on the wide veranda of his ranch house, watching the sun settle behind the rolling Oklahoma hills like a copper coin dropped into a collection plate. The silver pocket watch in his vest, his father's watch, passed down through 3 generations of Vance men, ticked steadily against his chest, marking time that seemed to move differently out here in the vastness of his land. He pulled the watch free and opened its worn cover, studying the inscription his grandfather had engraved there. "Time is the only wealth we cannot recover." The old man had been right about that, though he'd probably never imagined his grandson would have so much time and so little purpose to fill it with. The memory of the afternoon's events played through his mind like a song he couldn't shake. The young woman's face, pale beneath the prairie sun, her fingers gripping that frayed rope as if it were the last thread connecting her to hope itself. Lila Monroe. He'd asked around after the auction and learned her name, her story. Robert. Monroe's widow, carrying her 3rd child and fighting to keep food on the table for the 2 she already had. What had possessed him to step forward like that? Grayson had attended dozens of auctions over the years, watching families lose their livelihoods to circumstance and misfortune. He'd felt sympathy, certainly, had even contributed quietly to church funds that helped the most desperate cases. But he'd never made such a public display before, never acted on impulse like some knight from the storybooks his mother used to read him. The truth was, something in Lila Monroe's bearing had reminded him of Catherine, not in appearance. Catherine had been blonde where this woman was dark, petite where Lila was sturdy with the practical strength of someone who'd learned to rely on herself. But there had been something in the set of her shoulders, the way she'd lifted her chin, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. That same quiet dignity Catherine had worn like armor during her final months, when the consumption had stolen her breath, but not her grace. Grayson closed the pocket watch with a soft click and returned it to his vest. 5 years since he'd buried Catherine and their infant son, both taken by the influenza that had swept through the county like wildfire. 5 years of rattling around this big house alone, tended by Mrs. Patterson, who came twice a week to cook and clean, surrounded by wealth that felt more like a burden than a blessing. He'd built the ranch as a testament to their future together. The sprawling house with its wide porches and multiple bedrooms, the barns designed to house the finest cattle in 3 counties, the fields that stretched to the horizon. All of it meant to be filled with the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, the comfortable rhythms of a life lived in partnership. Instead, he'd become something of a local curiosity. The rich widower who kept to himself, conducted his business with quiet efficiency, and showed up to church every Sunday to sit in the same pew alone. Respectable women in town had made their interest known over the years, some with more subtlety than others. Mrs. Henderson from the bank had taken to inviting him for Sunday dinner with increasing frequency, always mentioning how her sister from Tulsa would be visiting, such a lovely woman, recently widowed herself. But Grayson had felt nothing. Not the stirring of attraction, not even the mild companionship that might have grown into something warmer given time. He'd begun to wonder if that part of him had died with Catherine, buried under 6 feet of red Oklahoma soil. Until this afternoon, when a pregnant widow's quiet desperation had moved him to action before his practical mind could intervene. The rational thing would be to leave well enough alone. He'd done his good deed, satisfied whatever impulse had driven him to help. The woman would sell the cow eventually, probably had to, given what he'd heard about her circumstances. His $50 might buy her a few more weeks, but it wouldn't. Solve the fundamental problem of a woman alone, trying to make a living from land that barely sustained families with 2 working adults. But as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Grayson found himself thinking about those 2 children he'd glimpsed in the wagon. The girl with serious eyes who watched everything. The boy who still bounced with the resilience of someone, too young to understand how precarious their situation had become. What would happen to them when their mother's strength finally gave out? His housekeeper had mentioned hearing talk in town about the Monroe place. Bank troubles, they said. Debts that had been mounting since Robert Monroe's death 3 years ago. Winter coming on, and a baby due, with no man to help bear the load. Grayson made his decision, as he often did, quietly, with the methodical consideration that had served him well in business. Tomorrow he would ride over to the Monroe homestead, not to interfere, not to play the hero, but simply to see if there was some practical way he could help. A job, perhaps, something that would allow the woman to maintain her dignity while providing for her family. It was what Catherine would have wanted him to do. She'd always had a soft heart for those in need, had been the one to suggest donations to the church fund, to insist they keep extra food on hand for travelers who might need a meal. "We've been blessed with abundance," she used to say. "It's our responsibility to share it wisely." The pocket watch chimed the hour, and Grayson turned to go inside, already planning what he would say to Lila Monroe when he saw her again. The sound of hooves on hard-packed earth drew Lila from her morning chores, and she straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her aching back. Through the kitchen window, she watched a rider approach on a fine bay horse, and her stomach clenched with recognition even before she could make out the man's features clearly. Grayson Vance sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, but there was something different about him now, away from the crowds and dust of the auction yard. He seemed larger somehow, more substantial, his broad shoulders filling out his work shirt in a way that spoke of real labor despite his wealth. When he dismounted and removed his hat, revealing hair the color of winter wheat, touched with early silver, Lila found herself smoothing her apron with nervous hands. "Mrs. Monroe," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I hope I'm not intruding." She stepped onto the porch, acutely aware of how her homestead must appear to someone accustomed to prosperity. The sagging roofline, the chickens, scratching in the bare dirt where grass had once grown, the general air of barely controlled decay that seemed to cling to everything despite her best efforts to maintain some dignity. "Mr. Vance," she inclined her head politely, though wariness crept into her voice. "What brings you out this way?" Emma appeared at her elbow, having inherited her mother's cautious nature, while Samuel bounded down the porch steps with the fearless curiosity of a 5-year-old. "You're the man with the nice boots," he announced, pointing at Grayson's polished leather footwear with obvious admiration. A genuine smile softened Grayson's weathered features. "That I am, son. And you must be Samuel. Your mother mentioned you yesterday." Lila frowned slightly. She couldn't recall mentioning her children's names at the auction, but perhaps word traveled faster in small communities than she'd realized. "Children, go check on Bessie," she instructed, though Emma lingered close enough to overhear while Samuel skipped toward the makeshift barn. "I'll speak plainly, Mrs. Monroe," Grayson said, turning his attention back to her. "I've heard talk in town about your situation. I know it's not my business, but I wondered if there might be some way I could help." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Vance, but we're managing just fine. Are you?" His question was gentle but direct, and his gaze took in the patched roof, the thin children, the obvious signs of struggle that no amount of pride could completely hide. "Forgive me for being blunt, but you're carrying a child. Winter's coming. And from what I understand, the bank isn't inclined toward patience these days." Lila's hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly, where the baby stirred, as if responding to the tension in her voice. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Vance?" "Work," he said simply. "I'm in need of someone to manage my household. My current arrangement with Mrs. Patterson is adequate, but she only comes twice a week, and frankly, the place could use a woman's touch on a more regular basis. Cooking, some cleaning, perhaps helping with correspondence and accounts. The work wouldn't be too strenuous, and there are quarters on the property that would be suitable for you and your children." The offer hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial. Lila studied his face, searching for signs of the ulterior motives she'd learned to expect from men who offered help to desperate women, but she found only steady sincerity in his grey eyes, a patience that suggested he understood the magnitude of what he was asking. "And in return," she asked carefully, "room and board for your family, plus wages sufficient to meet your obligations. Your debts would be your own to manage, but at least you'd have the means to do so." Behind her, she could feel Emma listening with the intensity of a child who'd learned too young that adult conversations often determined the shape of their world. The eviction notice crackled in her memory. 30 days counting down like a death sentence. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you make such an offer to a stranger?" Grayson replaced his hat, settling it carefully on his head, as if buying time to consider his answer. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested hard-won wisdom. "I've been blessed with more than I need, Mrs. Monroe. My wife used. To say that blessing unused becomes a burden. Perhaps it's time I listened to her counsel." The mention of his wife surprised Lila. She'd heard he was a widower, but knew few details about his loss. Something in his tone suggested the wound was still tender despite the years that must have passed. "I'll need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course, but don't take too long. Winter has a way of making decisions for us if we wait too long to make them ourselves." He mounted his horse with fluid grace, then looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Your children deserve better than watching you struggle alone, Mrs. Monroe. Sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing we can do." As he rode away, Lila remained on the porch long after the dust had settled, one hand resting on her belly while the other clutched the porch rail for support. The practical part of her mind was already calculating advantages and risks, but her heart wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Could she trust this man's motives? Could she afford not to? The eviction notice seemed to pulse with malevolent life, where it lay on Lila's kitchen table, the red ink of the official stamp like dried blood against the white paper. She'd read it so many times over the past 3 days that she could recite every word, every legal phrase that boiled down to a simple truth. They had 27 days left in the only home her children had ever known. 27 days to find a miracle or accept the help of a man whose motives she still couldn't fully understand. Lila moved around her small kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing what might be their last breakfast in this house. The familiar rhythm of her morning routine, stoking the fire, measuring precious coffee grounds, slicing the bread she'd baked with flour bought on credit, felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that each action might be numbered. "Mama, why do you keep looking at that paper?" Emma asked from her seat at the worn wooden table, her serious 8-year-old eyes missing nothing. "Just thinking through some things, sweetheart." Lila placed a thin slice of bread and a precious spoonful of jam before her daughter, then repeated the process for Samuel, who was still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Are we gonna have to move?" Emma's question was asked with the matter-of-fact tone of a child who'd learned not to expect sugar-coating from the adults in her life. Lila's hand stilled on the coffee pot. There was no point in lying. Emma was too observant, and the girl had already endured enough broken promises from life to last a lifetime. We might have to, yes. Samuel's head snapped up, suddenly alert. Where would we go? I'm not sure yet. She poured herself a cup of the weak coffee, more for the comfort of holding something warm than for any hope of finding energy in its pale contents. But we'll figure something out. We always do. The words rang hollow even to her own ears. What they'd done so far was barely survive, scraping together enough to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, but just barely. The pregnancy was making everything harder. Her energy flagged by afternoon, her back ached constantly, and the simple tasks that once came easily now left her breathless and exhausted. After breakfast, she sent the children out to tend to their small flock of chickens, while she stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the land that had once represented hope and security. Robert had chosen this spot carefully, positioning their house to catch the morning sun and shelter from the worst of the winter winds. He'd planted the oak tree by the front porch with his own hands, saying it would grow tall and strong alongside their children. The tree was still there, barely taller than it had been 5 years ago, struggling like everything else to find purchase. In soil that seemed determined to reject their dreams, a sharp kick from the baby brought her back to the present moment. She placed both hands on her swollen belly, feeling the child's restless movements. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "What would your papa want us to do?" But she knew what Robert would have wanted. He'd have wanted her to swallow her pride and do whatever it took to keep their children safe and fed. He'd been a practical man, quick to adapt when circumstances required it, never one to let stubborn independence get in the way of his family's welfare. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face grave with the particular solemnity that had become too familiar since Robert's death. "Mama, I think we should go live with the nice man." Lila blinked in surprise. "Emma, you don't understand." "I understand. That we don't have enough food," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying a steadiness that broke Lila's heart. "I understand that you cry sometimes when you think Samuel and I are asleep. I understand that Samuel is getting skinny and you're tired all the time because of the baby." The simple honesty of her daughter's words hit Lila like a physical blow. She'd thought she was protecting them by hiding her fears, but children saw more than adults gave them credit for. Emma had been watching, cataloguing each sign of their deteriorating situation with the sharp awareness of someone who'd learned too young that the world was not a safe place. "And I understand," Emma continued, moving closer to take her mother's hand, "that sometimes grown-ups need help, even when they don't want to ask for it." Tears threatened at the corners of Lila's eyes. When had her 8-year-old daughter become so wise? When had the natural order of things reversed so completely that the child was comforting the parent? "You think we should trust Mr. Vance?" Emma nodded solemnly. "He didn't have to help us at the auction. He could have just bought Bessie and kept her. But he gave her back. That means something, doesn't it? From the mouth of babes." Lila pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, still sweet despite their reduced circumstances. Emma was right, of course. Whatever Vance's motivations, his actions so far, had been those of a man who understood the value of kindness. "All right," she said quietly. "All right, we'll give it a try." That afternoon, she walked the perimeter of their small property one last time, memorizing the view from every angle. She picked a handful of wildflowers from the patch by the old well and pressed them between the pages of her mother's Bible, the same Bible that would travel with them to whatever came next. When Samuel asked why she was packing their few belongings into the battered trunk that had come west with her own parents, she simply said, "We're going on an adventure." What kind of adventure, he wanted to know, bouncing on his toes with excitement. The kind where we find out what happens when we're brave enough to try something new. As the sun set on their last day in the house Robert had built, Lila sat on the front porch steps with Emma and Samuel pressed close against her sides. Tomorrow, they would load their possessions into the wagon and drive to Grayson Vance's ranch. Tomorrow, they would begin a new chapter in a story she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, they would say goodbye to the only home her children had ever known, and trust that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was accept help when it was offered with an open heart. The Vance Ranch spread before them like something from a storybook, all rolling green pastures and whitewashed fences that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Lila gripped the wagon's reins tighter as they approached. The main house, a sprawling structure that could have swallowed their old homestead 3 times over. Wide porches wrapped around 2 stories of solid construction, with tall windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun and spoke of prosperity she'd only imagined. "Look at all those horses." Samuel's voice carried pure wonder as he pointed toward a distant corral where a dozen animals grazed peacefully. Even from this distance, Lila could see they were fine stock, well-fed and groomed, their coats shining with health. Emma sat quietly beside her, taking in everything with those serious eyes that seemed to catalogue each detail for future reference. "It's very big," she observed, and Lila heard both awe and uncertainty in her daughter's voice. Grayson emerged from the main house before they'd fully stopped, and Lila noticed he'd changed from his usual work clothes into a clean shirt and vest, as if their arrival warranted special attention. The gesture touched her more than she cared to admit. When had anyone last made an effort on her behalf? Mrs. Monroe, children. He approached the wagon with that easy confidence she was beginning to recognize, but something in his manner seemed almost nervous. "Welcome to Vance Ranch." He helped her down from the wagon seat with careful courtesy, his work gloves rough against her hands, but his touch gentle enough to accommodate her condition. The baby shifted restlessly, as if responding to the change in surroundings, and Lila pressed one hand to her side where a small foot seemed determined to find her ribs. "Thank you," she said simply, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he was offering. Around them, the ranch hummed with quiet activity, hands moving cattle in a distant field, the rhythmic sound of someone chopping wood, the comfortable noise of a place where useful work was being done. "Let me show you to your quarters first," Grayson suggested, lifting their trunk from the wagon as if it weighed nothing. "Then we can discuss the arrangement in more detail." He led them toward a smaller building, set back from the main house, but still substantial by any measure. It had been constructed with the same care as the larger structure, with a covered porch and windows that would let in plenty of morning light. Inside, Lila found herself speechless. 3 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, a bedroom that would accommodate her and the children comfortably, and a small kitchen area with a pump for water and a stove that looked newer than anything she'd ever cooked on. The furniture was simple but well made, and someone had taken the trouble to place fresh wildflowers in a mason jar on the kitchen table. "I hope it suits," Grayson said, and she heard genuine concern in his voice. "Mrs. Patterson helped me get it ready. She thought you might appreciate having your own space rather than staying in the main house." "It's perfect." The words came out rougher than she'd intended, emotion thickening her voice. She cleared her throat and tried again. "It's more than generous, Mr. Vance." Samuel had already discovered the bedroom and was bouncing on one of the beds with unrestrained delight. "Mama, this one's so soft. And look, there's a window right by where I sleep." Emma explored more cautiously, running her hands along the smooth wood of the kitchen table, testing the pump handle to see the clear water flow. "There's no bucket to carry," she said with amazement. "The water just comes right inside." "Modern conveniences," Grayson explained with a slight smile. "I had the pump installed when I built the place. Seemed practical." Practical. Lila was beginning to understand that Grayson Vance approached most things from a position of practical consideration. rather than sentiment, which somehow made his kindness feel more solid, more trustworthy. Sentimental gestures could be withdrawn when emotions changed, but practical arrangements tended to endure. "About the work," she began, wanting to establish the terms clearly from the beginning. "What exactly would you need me to do?" "Cooking. Primarily. I take my meals at irregular hours, and frankly my attempts at feeding myself have been less than successful." He gestured toward the main house. "Some light housekeeping, though I'm not looking for someone to follow me around with. A dust cloth, management of household accounts and correspondence. I assume you can read and write?" Yes. She didn't mention that she'd been the one to keep all the books for their farm, that Robert had relied on her careful figures to track their expenses and plan their planting. That skill might serve her well here. "Excellent. The pay is $15 a month, plus your housing and meals for the family. Does that seem fair?" $15. More than she'd seen in cash money for months, enough to begin paying down their debts and maybe even save a little for the uncertain future. "Very fair," she managed. "Good. Then shall we establish some ground rules?" His tone became more businesslike, which she appreciated. Clear expectations would make this arrangement easier for both of them. "I rise early and often work late, so your schedule can be flexible around the children's needs. The main house has a bell system. If I need something urgently, I can ring from my office. Otherwise, I'll try not to intrude on your family time." He paused, studying her face carefully. "Mrs. Monroe, I want to be clear about something. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. You'll be working for wages, not accepting charity. You don't owe me gratitude beyond what any employer deserves. From a competent employee, is that understood?" Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. He was giving her dignity, along with employment, treating her as a capable woman, rather than an object of pity. "Understood." "Mr. Vance, Grayson," he corrected gently, "will be working closely together. Formality seems unnecessary." "Lila," she offered in return, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at the intimacy the exchange implied. That evening, as she prepared their first meal in the little kitchen, Lila found herself moving with more energy than she'd felt in months. The stove heated evenly. The pump provided abundant water, and the pantry, which Grayson had stocked with basic supplies, contained luxuries she'd almost forgotten existed. Real coffee, white flour, sugar that didn't need to be rationed by the teaspoon. Through the window, she could see Emma and Samuel exploring the area around their new home, their voices carrying on the evening air as they discovered wonders that ranged from a swing hanging from an old oak tree to a barn cat willing to tolerate their attention. For the first time in 3 years, Lila allowed herself to believe that perhaps their luck was finally changing. 2 weeks into their new life at the Vance Ranch, Lila had discovered that Grayson was a man of predictable habits who appreciated routine as much as she did. He rose before dawn to check on the livestock, returned to the main house for breakfast at 7 sharp, spent his mornings in the fields or dealing with ranch business, and preferred his evening meal served at 6 o'clock precisely. Between these fixed points, he moved through his day with the steady efficiency of someone who'd learned to structure time in the absence of family obligations. This morning, as she prepared his usual breakfast of eggs, bacon, and strong coffee, Lila found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch steps. It had become a comforting marker of the day's beginning, that steady tread that spoke of purpose and reliability. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, and hair slightly damp from washing, she had his plate ready and waiting. "Morning, Lila!" The use of her given name still sent a small flutter through her chest, though she'd grown more comfortable with the informal address. "Sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you." She poured his coffee, noting the way he automatically moved to hold. The door opened as Samuel came barreling through, still in his nightshirt and barefoot despite the morning chill. "Mr. Grayson!" The boy launched himself toward the tall rancher with the fearless affection of a child who'd never learned to doubt his welcome. "Can I help feed the horses today?" "Please?" Grayson caught the boy easily. steadying him with one large hand. "After you're dressed and fed, we'll see about it, but the horses need their breakfast on schedule, just like people do." Samuel nodded solemnly and scampered back toward their quarters, calling for Emma to hurry up and get dressed. Watching the exchange, Lila felt something twist in her chest. Pleasure at seeing her son so happy, mixed with a deeper ache she didn't want to examine too closely. "He's taken quite a shine to you," she observed, settling a plate of scrambled eggs before Grayson. The feeling's mutual. Grayson took a careful sip of his coffee, and Lila noticed how his weathered hands handled the delicate china cup with surprising gentleness. "He reminds me of myself at that age, full of questions, and convinced that horses are the most fascinating creatures on earth." The mention of his childhood was the first personal detail he'd shared, beyond the basic facts of his widowhood. And Lila found herself curious, despite her determination to maintain professional boundaries. "Did you grow up on a ranch?" "This ranch." He gestured toward the window that looked out over the rolling pastures. "My grandfather homesteaded this land, my father expanded it, and I've been trying to make something worthy of their efforts ever since." There was weight in those words, the burden of legacy and expectation that she recognized from her own family's more modest aspirations. Her parents had crossed 3 states to claim their small plot of Oklahoma territory, dreaming of something better for their children. She'd married Robert with similar hopes, believing they could build something lasting together. 3 generations of Vance men, she said softly. That's quite a heritage to uphold. Sometimes I wonder if they'd recognize what I've made of their work. Grayson finished his eggs and pushed back from the table, but made no move to leave. Immediately, "My grandfather would have filled this house with children by now. My father had 4 sons before he was my age." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Lila busied herself clearing his plate, acutely aware of his presence in the small kitchen, the way his shoulders nearly brushed the doorframe when he stood. "Children come in their own time," she said carefully, "or they don't come at all, through no fault of anyone involved." "Is that what you tell yourself about the baby you're carrying?" The question was gentle but direct, and it caught her off guard. She paused in her cleaning, one hand moving instinctively to her rounded belly. "I tell myself that every child is a gift, even when the circumstances aren't ideal." Robert would have been pleased to know about this one. The use of her late husband's name surprised her. She'd mentioned him only in passing, but Grayson had clearly been listening, filing away details about her life before they'd met. "Yes," she said quietly. "He always said he wanted a house full of children's laughter. Then this baby is wanted. Very much so." She met his eyes across the small kitchen, struck by the understanding she found there. Even if the timing is complicated. Emma appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and with her hair neatly braided, carrying the wooden toy horse that had belonged to her father. She held it carefully, as if it were made of something more precious than simple carved wood, and Lila's heart clenched at the sight. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Emma said with the careful politeness she'd been taught. "Mama, Samuel is ready to help with the horses. He's wearing his good boots and everything." Grayson's attention shifted to the toy in Emma's hands. "That's a fine horse you have there, Miss Emma. Your father made it?" Emma nodded, then surprised them both by stepping closer to show him the carving. "He made it for Samuel, but Samuel lets me play with it sometimes. Papa said every cowboy needs a good horse. Your papa was a wise man." Grayson examined the toy with the same attention he might give to a piece of fine art. "This is beautiful. Work. See how he carved the mane to look like it's flowing in the wind, and the way the legs are positioned. This horse is running, not just standing still." Emma's face lit up with pleasure at having her treasure properly appreciated. "Papa was good at making things. He made Mama a jewelry box too, with little drawers that slide out smooth as butter. I'd like to see that sometime, if your Mama wouldn't mind showing it." Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks. The jewelry box sat on the dresser in their bedroom, holding her few remaining pieces of jewelry and serving as a daily reminder of Robert's gentle hands and patient craftsmanship. The thought of sharing that intimate piece of her past felt both appealing and terrifying. "Perhaps," she said non-committally, then changed the subject before Emma could volunteer to fetch it immediately. "You'd better collect Samuel before he decides to introduce himself to the horses without supervision." As Grayson left for his morning rounds with both children trailing behind him like devoted puppies, Lila found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching their small procession make its way toward the barn. Samuel's excited chatter carried on the morning air, punctuated by Emma's more thoughtful questions, while Grayson answered each inquiry with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed their company. When had her children become so comfortable with this man? When had she begun to feel something dangerously close to contentment in these quiet morning moments? And why did the sight of Grayson's gentle attention to her family make her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to name? Sunday morning arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, and Lila found herself standing before the small mirror in their bedroom, trying to decide whether the blue dress or the brown would draw less attention at church. Both were faded from washing and mended in places, but they were clean and pressed, which was the best she could manage. The blue brought out her eyes, but the brown was more practical, less likely to show the inevitable stains that came with wrangling two children through a church service. She chose the brown. Emma appeared beside her, wearing her one good dress, a simple green cotton that Lila had let out twice to accommodate her daughter's growing limbs. "Do you think people will stare at us, Mama?" The question revealed more awareness than Lila wished her 8-year-old possessed. "Some might," she answered honestly. "People are curious about new arrangements, especially in small towns like this. Because we live with Mr. Grayson now, because some people have narrow ideas about what's proper." Lila smoothed Emma's collar and checked that her hair ribbon was straight. "But we know our own hearts, and that's what matters most." Samuel bounded into the room, his hair slicked down with water but already beginning to rebel against the unfamiliar. "Discipline. Mr. Grayson says we can ride with him in his buggy. It has springs and everything." The mention of riding together made Lila's stomach flutter with anxiety. Arriving at church as a family unit would certainly fuel gossip, but the alternative, walking the 3 miles into town while heavily pregnant, was hardly practical. She'd already accepted so much help from Grayson. What was one more kindness in the face of necessity? The drive to Millfield's small white church proved pleasant enough, with Samuel chattering about everything he'd learned about horses and Emma sitting quietly between them, absorbing the countryside rolling past. Grayson drove with his usual competence, handling the reins with the same steady confidence he brought to everything else, but Lila noticed how his jaw tightened as they approached the church grounds where other families were gathering. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly as he helped her down from the buggy. "People will talk either way. You needn't subject yourself to their scrutiny on our account. Let them talk." His response was firm, though she caught the slight tension around his eyes. "We've done nothing wrong, and I won't have you walking into that church alone to face their whispers." The whispers began before they'd even reached the front steps. Lila felt them as surely as she felt the autumn breeze. Conversations that stopped mid-sentence when she passed, heads turning to follow their small group's progress, the particular quality of attention that meant she was being discussed and judged by people who knew nothing of her circumstances beyond idle speculation. Mrs. Henderson from the bank stood near the church doors with her sister from Tulsa, the one who'd been widowed and was supposedly such suitable company for eligible men. Both women watched Grayson with obvious calculation, their gazes sliding over Lila with thinly veiled disapproval, before lingering on her rounded belly with expressions that made her cheeks burn. "Grayson," Mrs. Henderson called out with forced cheer, "how lovely to see you, and this must be your housekeeper." The pause before the word housekeeper was deliberate, weighted with implication that made Lila's spine stiffen. She felt Grayson's hand settle briefly at the small of her back, a gesture of support that probably added fuel to whatever assumptions were already circulating. "Mrs. Munro is managing my household." "Yes," Grayson replied with the same even tone he used for discussing cattle prices, "and doing an excellent job of it. Mrs. Munro, I believe you know Mrs. Henderson from the bank." The introduction was perfectly proper, but it didn't prevent Mrs. Henderson's sharp smile or the way her gaze catalogued every detail of Lila's appearance. "Of course. How convenient for you both." Inside the church, Grayson led them to his usual pew, third row from the front on the right side, where the Vance family had apparently sat for 3 generations. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, including Reverend Matthews, whose eyebrows rose slightly when he spotted their little group. Lila tried to focus on the service, but she remained acutely aware of the attention directed their way. She could feel eyes boring into the back of her neck, could sense the subtle shift in the congregation's energy that spoke of judgment being passed. When Samuel leaned against Grayson's arm during the long sermon, and the man instinctively adjusted to make the boy more comfortable, the gesture drew audible murmurs from behind them. The church program crinkled in her hands as she gripped it tighter, the familiar hymn numbers and announcements becoming a lifeline to focus on while trying to ignore the weight of community disapproval. Emma sat perfectly still beside her, but Lila could sense her daughter's awareness of the tension, the way she'd learned to read adult moods for signs of trouble ahead. After the service, as they made their way toward the exit, Lila overheard fragments of conversation that felt like physical blows, living right there on his property. Awfully convenient, if you ask me. Pregnant woman and all, it's not proper. Adieu, poor thing, probably doesn't have much choice, but still. The pity in that last comment stung worse than outright condemnation. Lila quickened her pace, eager to reach the safety of Grayson's buggy, but found their path blocked by Tom Garrett, a local rancher she recognized from the auction where their story had begun. "Vance?" Garrett nodded to Grayson, then let his gaze slide deliberately over Lila and the children. "Interesting arrangement you've got yourself there. I beg your pardon." Grayson's voice carried a warning that would have stopped a wiser man. "Just saying it must be mighty convenient, having live-in help who's so grateful for your generosity." Garrett's smile was ugly, his implication clear enough to make several nearby women gasp. The change in Grayson was immediate and unmistakable. His shoulders squared, his jaw set, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made grown men step backward. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next words, Garrett. Mrs. Munro is a respectable woman who works hard to support her family. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The threat hung in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. Garrett's face flushed red, but he backed down, mumbling something about meaning no offense, before disappearing into the crowd. During the ride home, Lila sat rigidly beside Grayson, humiliation burning in her chest like swallowed fire. Emma pressed close against her side while Samuel, blessedly oblivious to the adult undercurrents, chattered about the music and asked when they could go back to hear more singing. "I'm sorry," Grayson said quietly, his words barely audible over the creak of the buggy wheels. "I should have anticipated that reaction. You defended us." The words came out rougher than she'd intended. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." His hands were steady on the reins, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "You're under my protection now, Lila. All of you. That means something, whether people choose to understand it or not. Under his protection." The phrase settled into her heart with both comfort and complication, carrying implications she wasn't sure either of them was ready to examine. But as they drove back toward the ranch in the afternoon sunlight, Lila found herself thinking that perhaps some kinds of protection were worth the price of a small town's narrow-minded gossip. The tension from Sunday's church service lingered. like smoke in still air. But by Wednesday evening, Lila found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of preparing dinner with something approaching peace. The kitchen had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the comfortable rituals of cooking while listening to the distant sounds of Grayson working in his office and her children playing outside. Tonight, she was attempting her mother's chicken and dumplings recipe, the handwritten instructions spread before her on the scarred wooden table where generations of ranch cooks had worked. The recipe book itself was a treasure, pages yellowed with age and splattered with the evidence of countless meals, margins filled with her mother's careful notations about adjustments for altitude and variations for special occasions. "Something smells like heaven in here," Grayson's voice came from the doorway, and Lila looked up to find him leaning against the frame, his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it. The sight sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Chicken and dumplings," she said, stirring the pot carefully. "My mother's recipe. She used to say it could cure anything from a broken heart to a winter cold. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." He stepped into the kitchen, moving with the careful courtesy that had become familiar over the past weeks. "May I?" When she nodded, he lifted the lid of the pot and breathed in the rich aroma. "It smells exactly like something my own mother used to make. I haven't had a proper home-cooked meal like this since—" He paused, and she saw the shadow of memory cross his features. "Since Catherine." The name slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No, it's all right." He replaced the lid gently and settled into one of the kitchen chairs, a gesture that suggested he wanted to stay and talk rather than simply passing through. Catherine was many things, but she never mastered the art of cooking. She used to joke that she could burn water if left unattended. The admission surprised Lila. She'd imagined his late wife as perfect in all domestic arts, the kind of woman who would have filled this big house with grace and competence. What was she like, Grayson? Was quiet for so long that Lila began to regret the question, but then he spoke with the careful tone of someone unused to sharing memories. She was bright, like sunlight on water, always moving, always planning some new project or adventure. She wanted to travel to California, maybe even Europe someday. Said Oklahoma was too small to contain all her dreams. "Did you want to go with her to California?" "I thought I did." He smiled, but it carried a wistful quality. "I was young enough to believe that love could transplant anywhere, that as long as we were together, the place didn't matter. But this land gets into your blood, you know. 3 generations of my family are buried in the cemetery behind the house. Sometimes I think Catherine understood that better than I did." Lila turned back to her cooking, giving him space for the memories while processing this glimpse into his past. She'd assumed his marriage had been the kind of perfect partnership that romance novels described, but the reality seemed more complex. 2 people who'd loved each other, but perhaps wanted different things from life. "What about you?" he asked, turning the conversation back to her. "Did you always want to stay in Oklahoma?" "I never thought about leaving." She ladled the dumplings into the pot, watching them settle into the simmering broth. "My parents came here from Tennessee when I was small, looking for their own piece of land. I met Robert when I was 17, married him at 19, and assumed we'd spend the rest of our lives building something together right here. Do you regret that choice now?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. She paused in her stirring, considering. "I regret that we didn't have more time. Robert was a good man, a gentle father. He deserved to see his children grow up to hold this baby I'm carrying, but regret marrying him? No, never that." Emma and Samuel's voices drifted through the window as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, their laughter bright against the evening air. Watching them through the window, Lila felt that familiar ache of love mixed with worry that came with single parenthood. "They're good children," Grayson observed, following her gaze. "You've raised them well. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping ahead of disaster." The admission slipped out before she could censor it. Emma's growing, up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should be mine. And Samuel, he needs a father's guidance more than I know how to give him. You're doing better than you think." Grayson's voice carried quiet conviction. "They're kind, well-mannered, curious about the world. Those are qualities that come from good parenting, not chance." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. When had she last received such straightforward appreciation? Robert had been generous with praise, but his loss had left her feeling uncertain about her abilities as a mother, especially facing the prospect of raising 3 children alone. "Samuel asks about you constantly," she found herself saying. "Wants to know everything about horses and cattle and ranch work. I think he's decided you're the most interesting person he's ever met. The feeling's mutual. That boy has more questions than a newspaper reporter." Grayson chuckled, and the sound transformed his features, making him look younger and less burdened by responsibility. Yesterday, he wanted to know if horses dream, and whether they dream in colors or just in shapes. "And what did you tell him?" "That I thought horses probably dream of running free across endless meadows with the wind in their manes and no fences to stop them." He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. Perhaps that was too fanciful. It was perfect. Lila turned to face him fully, struck by this glimpse of the man beneath the practical rancher's exterior. He needs someone who can feed his imagination along with his curiosity. Their eyes met across the small kitchen, and for a moment the air seemed charged with something more complex than simple employer-employee courtesy. Lila felt her breath catch, aware suddenly of how close they were sitting, how the lamplight softened the lines around his eyes and highlighted the silver threading through his hair. The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities neither seemed ready to name, until Samuel's voice calling for his mother broke the spell. "Mama, come see! The fireflies are dancing!" Lila moved toward the window, grateful for the interruption and the excuse to break eye contact. Outside, her children were indeed surrounded by the soft glow of fireflies, their small hands cupped carefully around the occasional captive that would soon be released back to the night. "Beautiful," Grayson said quietly, and when she glanced back at him, she wasn't entirely sure he was talking about the fireflies. The chicken and dumplings were ready, filling the kitchen with the comforting aromas of home and family. As Lila called the children in for dinner, she found herself thinking that some evenings settled into your heart like seeds, carrying the promise of something you hadn't known you were hoping for. The pain started as a dull ache during Thursday. Morning's breakfast preparations, settling low in Lila's back with the persistent throb of an old injury awakening. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on flipping pancakes and listening to Samuel's excited chatter about the new colt that had been born during the night. But by the time Grayson arrived for his morning meal, she found herself gripping the edge of the stove for support. "Everything all right?" His question was casual, but she caught the sharp attention in his eyes as he noted her careful movements. "Just tired," she deflected, setting his plate before him with hands that trembled slightly. "The baby was restless last night." It wasn't entirely a lie. The child had been active, pressing against her ribs and making comfortable sleep impossible. But the cramping sensation that had begun an hour ago felt different from the usual discomforts of pregnancy, carrying an urgency that made her chest tight with worry. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for the day with her hair neatly braided. At 8 years old, she'd developed an unsettling ability to read adult moods, and her serious gaze moved between her mother and Grayson with the wariness of someone who'd learned that changes in routine often meant trouble. "Mama, you look pale," she observed with characteristic directness. Before Lila could respond, another wave of cramping doubled her over, this one sharp enough to force a gasp from her lips. Grayson was on his feet immediately, his chair scraping against the wooden floor as he moved to steady her with gentle hands. "That's not tiredness," he said firmly. "You need to see Dr. Patterson." "I'm fine," Lila protested, though even as she spoke, cold sweat beaded on her forehead. "It's probably just The baby's getting bigger, pressing on things differently. Lila. The quiet authority in his voice made her look up at him. I've seen enough pregnant cattle to know when something's not right. You're going to see the doctor, and that's the end of it. The comparison to livestock might have offended her under different circumstances, but the genuine concern in his expression overrode any wounded pride. Besides, another cramp was building, this one strong enough to make her lean heavily against him for support. Emma, run and tell Samuel to stay close to the house today, Grayson instructed, while keeping one steadying arm around Lila's waist. I'm taking your mother to town. Is the baby coming? Emma's voice carried the controlled fear of a child who'd already lost one parent and understood that life could change without warning. Not yet, Lila managed, though uncertainty colored her words. It's too early. The baby's not due for another 2 months. The ride to town passed in a blur of discomfort and worry. Grayson drove with careful attention to every rut and bump in the road, but even his considerate handling of the reins couldn't prevent the jolting that made each cramp worse. Lila found herself gripping his arm during the worst moments, grateful for his solid presence and the way he murmured reassurances without making her feel foolish for her fears. Dr. Patterson's office occupied the front room of his modest house on Millfield's Main Street, and Lila had always found comfort in the man's gentle competence. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd delivered half the babies in the county and seen every medical crisis the frontier could produce. His leather-bound medical journal lay open on his desk when they arrived, filled with careful notations in his precise handwriting. The book represented years of accumulated knowledge and experience, each page a testament to his dedication to healing, in a place where medical help was often scarce and precious. Mrs. Monroe, Dr. Patterson greeted her with professional warmth, before turning to acknowledge Grayson with a slight nod. Mr. Vance, what seems to be the trouble? Lila explained her symptoms, while the doctor listened with the focused attention that had made him beloved throughout the community. His examination was thorough but gentle, his questions probing but kind, and when he finally sat back in his chair, his expression was thoughtful but not alarmed. The good news, he began, is that the baby seems to be fine. Strong heartbeat, good positioning, but you're showing signs of what we call threatened preterm labor. Your body is preparing for birth earlier than it should. The words hit Lila like cold water. What does that mean? Will the baby, with proper care and rest, we can often delay delivery until the child is more developed, Dr. Patterson assured her. But it means significant changes to your routine. Complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. No lifting, no extended standing, no strenuous activity of any kind. Lila's mind immediately went to her work responsibilities, the cooking and cleaning that constituted her livelihood. Doctor, I have obligations. Mr. Vance employs me to manage his household. Then Mr. Vance will have to manage without you for a while, the doctor said firmly, or find temporary help. This baby's life may depend on your willingness to follow my instructions. Grayson, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the examination, spoke for the first time. Don't worry about the work, Lila. We'll figure something out. But our agreement includes keeping you and the baby healthy, he interrupted gently. Everything else can be adjusted. Dr. Patterson reached for a bottle of dark liquid from his medicine cabinet. I'm giving you a tonic to help with the cramping, and I want to see you again in 3 days. If the pains worsen or if you notice any bleeding, send for me immediately, day or night. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the morning's urgent trip to town. Lila sat carefully beside Grayson, one hand resting on her belly where the baby moved with reassuring regularity. The cramping had eased somewhat after Dr. Patterson's examination and medicine, but the weight of his instructions pressed down on her like a physical burden. I can't just lie in bed for weeks, she said finally, voicing the worry that had been building since they left the doctor's office. Emma and Samuel need supervision. Meals need to be cooked. The house will manage perfectly well with some adjustments, Grayson finished. Mrs. Patterson can increase her hours, maybe bring her daughter to help with the children. We'll work it out. The cost is my concern, not yours. His tone was gentle, but final. Lila, you're carrying precious cargo. Everything else is secondary to keeping you and that baby safe. As they approached the ranch, Lila found herself studying Grayson's profile, noting the determined set of his jaw and the way his hands held the reins with steady confidence. When had this man's well-being become so intertwined with her own? When had his concern begun to feel less like employer consideration and more like something deeper, more personal? The question followed her into the quiet bedroom where she would spend the coming weeks, accompanied by the sound of Grayson's voice outside her window as he explained the situation to Emma and Samuel with the patient kindness that was becoming. As familiar as his morning coffee routine, whatever was growing between them would have to wait, suspended like her own life in the careful balance between hope and uncertainty that marked the remaining months until her child's arrival. 3 days into her prescribed bed rest, Lila was discovering that enforced idleness could be its own form of torment. She lay propped against pillows in the small bedroom, listening to the sounds of life continuing without her. Emma's patient voice teaching Samuel his letters, Mrs. Patterson's daughter Mary chattering as she helped with the cooking, Grayson's boots on the porch as he checked on her between his ranch duties. The cramping had subsided to occasional twinges, and the baby seemed content to remain where nature intended for now. But the helplessness of depending on others for everything from meals to childcare chafed against her independent spirit, like an ill-fitting harness. When the knock came at the front door that Thursday afternoon, Lila recognized trouble in the sharp, official sound of it. She heard Mary's young voice answering, then the heavier tread of a man's boots crossing the wooden floor of the main room. Through her partially open bedroom door, she caught fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Here about the Monroe property debts, court order for immediate collection, additional interest and penalties. Emma appeared in her doorway, face pale with the particular fear that came with recognizing adult crisis. "Mama, there's a man here asking about Papa's farm. He has papers." Lila struggled to sit up straighter, her heart racing in a way that couldn't be good for the baby. "Help me get to the sitting room, sweetheart." But Dr. Patterson said, "This can't wait." Lila swung her legs over the side of the bed, moving carefully but with determination. If someone was here about Robert's debts, she needed to face it directly rather than hiding behind medical restrictions. The man in their small sitting room looked exactly like what he was, a debt collector who'd learned to dress respectably, while maintaining the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to taking what little people had left. He wore a brown suit that had seen better days and carried a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained the legal documents that could destroy what remained of her family's security. "Mrs. Monroe, I presume." He didn't wait for confirmation. "I'm Clayton Webb, representing Farmers Trust Bank in Oklahoma City. I have here a final demand for payment of outstanding debts on the property formerly owned by your late husband, Robert Monroe." Lila remained standing, despite the weakness in her legs, unwilling to show vulnerability to this man who radiated practiced indifference to human suffering. "I was under the impression that matter had been settled when I surrendered the property to the local bank. Local arrangements don't supersede prior liens," Webb replied, consulting his papers with theatrical precision. "Your husband borrowed against the property through our institution in 1932, using the land as collateral for farming equipment. The debt was never satisfied, and with accumulated interest and penalties, now amounts to $647. The sum hit her like a physical blow. $600 might as well have been $6,000 for all her ability to pay it. That's impossible. Robert never mentioned desperate men often make financial arrangements they prefer not to discuss with their wives. Webb interrupted with the casual cruelty of someone who'd delivered similar news countless times. The debt exists, Mrs. Monroe, and it's legally collectible from his estate. What estate? The question came out sharper than she'd intended. As you can see, we have nothing left. Webb's gaze moved around their modest quarters with calculating assessment. I understand you're currently employed by Mr. Grayson Vance, residing on his property. That suggests assets that could be applied to this debt. My employment has nothing to do with my late husband's obligations. Perhaps not, but your wages do. We're prepared to garnish any income you receive until this debt is satisfied. He withdrew a yellow document from his satchel, the original land deed that represented all of Robert's hopes and dreams for their future. This shows clear title pledged as security. The obligation survives the borrower. Lila sank into a chair despite her determination to remain standing. The legal implications were crushing enough, but the sight of that deed, Robert's signature bold and confident in the bottom corner, brought back the memory of the day he'd bought their land. How proud he'd been to own something substantial to pass down to their children. "How long do I have?" she asked quietly. 30 days from service of this notice. After that, we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies, including potential garnishment of wages and seizure of any assets held in your name. The sound of horses, approaching at speed, interrupted Webb's recitation of legal threats. Through the window, Lila could see Grayson riding hard toward the house, his urgency suggesting someone had informed him of their unexpected visitor. Behind him came Dr. Patterson in his buggy, apparently arriving for her scheduled checkup. Grayson dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and strode into the house with an expression that would have given pause to a wiser man than Clayton. Webb, his gaze took in Lila's pallor, the papers scattered on the table, and the debt collector's predatory presence with immediate understanding. "What's going on here?" The question was addressed to Lila, but his eyes never left Webb's face. "Mr. Webb was just explaining additional debts left by my late husband," Lila managed, though her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. Dr. Patterson entered behind Grayson, medical bag in hand, and immediately moved to Lila's side with professional concern. "Mrs. Monroe, you should be in bed. This kind of stress is exactly what we need to avoid. Perhaps we should continue this discussion at a more appropriate time," Grayson suggested to Webb, though the words carried the weight of a command rather than a request. "I'm afraid the law doesn't accommodate medical conditions," Webb replied with oily smoothness. "Mrs. Monroe has been properly served with notice of the debt collection proceedings. The timeline begins now, regardless of her health situation." Grayson's jaw tightened. "How much?" "I beg your pardon?" "The debt. How much does she owe?" Webb consulted his papers again, though Lila suspected he knew the figure by heart. $647, plus costs and fees. The sum hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and threatening to everything in its path. Lila watched Grayson's face, seeing calculation replace anger as he processed the implications. $600 represented serious money, even for a man of his means, months of her wages or the price of several head of good cattle. "I see." Grayson's tone had gone carefully neutral. "And if this debt were satisfied immediately, then Mrs. Monroe would be clear of all obligations related to her late husband's estate," Webb confirmed, perking up at the possibility of immediate collection. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat pointedly. "Gentlemen, my patient needs rest and quiet. This discussion is causing exactly the kind of agitation that could endanger both mother and child." As the doctor helped her back to the bedroom, Lila caught Grayson's eye across the small room. What she saw there, determination mixed, with something deeper, more personal, both comforted and terrified her. She'd entered his employment to maintain her independence, not to become an even greater burden on his generosity. But as she settled back against her pillows, while the murmur of male voices continued in the next room, Lila found herself wondering whether independence was a luxury she could still afford, and whether accepting help from someone who offered it freely might be less shameful than losing everything to the calculated cruelty of men like Clayton Webb. The house settled into evening quiet after Clayton Webb's departure, but the peace felt fragile, like the moment before a storm when the air grows still and heavy with unspoken threats. Lila lay in her bed, turning her wedding ring around and around on her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed after Robert's death, when the simple gold band had become both comfort and burden, reminder of love lost and promises that could no longer be kept. The ring had been Robert's grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Monroe women who'd worn it through their own struggles and triumphs. Now it felt loose on her finger, made so by the weight she'd lost during these difficult months, and sometimes she feared it might slip off entirely, taking with it the last tangible connection to the life they'd planned together. A soft knock at her bedroom door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Emma or perhaps Mrs. Patterson's daughter Mary checking on her evening needs. Instead, Grayson appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with tea and what looked like some of Mary's fresh-baked bread. The domestic gesture looked incongruous, coming from a man whose hands were more accustomed to handling cattle and business ledgers than fine china, but he managed it with the same careful competence he brought to everything else. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on the small table beside her bed. "Mary said you barely touched your dinner." "I'm not very hungry these days." It was true. Anxiety had stolen her appetite along with her peace of mind. "But thank you. That was thoughtful." He remained standing awkwardly beside her bed, clearly wanting to say something, but struggling with how to begin. Finally, he pulled the room's single chair closer and sat down, his large frame making the delicate furniture look almost comically small. "About this afternoon," he began. "About Webb and the debt—" "Please don't." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "I know what you're thinking, and I can't accept it. I won't be responsible for you throwing away $600 on problems that aren't yours to solve." "Aren't they?" His question was quiet, but direct. "Lila, when I offered you employment, I knew you were carrying more than just household responsibilities. A woman doesn't end up at a cattle auction, selling her last cow, unless she's fighting battles I can't even imagine." She twisted the wedding ring again, the movement unconscious but telling. "Those battles are mine to fight, Grayson. Robert's debts, my children's future, this baby, all of it is my responsibility. I won't add to your burdens just because I've proven inadequate to handle my own." "Inadequate?" The word seemed to surprise him. "Lila, you've been raising 2 children alone while pregnant, working to pay off debts you probably didn't even know existed, keeping your family fed and clothed with resources that would barely sustain 1 person, let alone 3. If that's inadequate, then the rest of us are hopeless." Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, and she turned away to hide them. "I failed him, Grayson. Robert trusted me to take care of our family if something happened to him, and I've made a mess of everything. I'm losing our home, I can't provide properly for our children, and now there are debts I never knew about that could follow us for years." "You didn't fail anyone." His voice carried a firmness that made her look back at him. "You've been dealt a hand that would break most people, and you're still fighting, still standing, still putting your children's needs before your own pride." "My pride is about all I have left." "No, it isn't." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, and when he spoke again, his voice held a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "Lila, I need to tell you something about why I helped you that day at the auction, why I offered you work, why I'm sitting here now wanting to solve problems that you insist aren't mine." Something in his tone made her breath catch. "Grayson, let me finish, please." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "When Catherine died, I thought love died with her. Thought that part of me was buried alongside her and our son, and that I'd spend the rest of my life going through the motions of living without ever really feeling alive again. The admission hung between them like a bridge being built across dangerous water, each word a plank laid down with careful precision. I told myself I was helping you because it was the Christian thing to do, because Catherine would have wanted me to show kindness to someone in need, and that was true at first, but it stopped being about Catherine weeks ago. Lila's wedding ring felt suddenly tight on her finger, as if her body was responding to possibilities her mind wasn't ready to acknowledge. What are you saying? I'm saying that watching you with your children, seeing how you handle every crisis with grace and determination, listening to you talk about your dreams and fears, it's brought me back to life in ways I didn't think were possible anymore. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I'm saying that your problems have become mine because you've become important to me, more important than I probably have any right to admit. The words settled between them like seeds in fertile ground, carrying the potential for growth neither of them had planned. Lila stared at him, seeing for the first time past the careful employer facade to the lonely man beneath. Someone who'd been as lost as she was, in his own way. I can't ask you to take on my burdens, Grayson. It wouldn't be fair. You're not asking, I'm offering. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hands with his own. His skin was warm and calloused from honest work, and she found herself noting how perfectly her fingers fit between his. I'm offering to help because I care about you, about Emma and Samuel, about the baby you're carrying. I'm offering because the thought of you struggling alone, while I have the means to help, makes me feel like the worst kind of coward. And if I accept, what then? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. What happens between us if I let you solve my problems with your money? Then we figure it out together, he said simply. We take things as they come, honest with each other about what we're feeling and what we want. No expectations, no obligations beyond what we choose to give. Lila looked down at their joined hands, her wedding ring catching the lamplight between his work-roughened fingers. For 3 years, she'd worn that ring as armor against the possibility of loving again, as protection against the vulnerability that came with opening her heart to someone new. But sitting here in the gentle glow of evening, listening to this good man offer her not just financial help, but something far more precious, she found herself wondering if protection had become its own kind of prison. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. So am I. His thumb traced gently across her knuckles. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch settled around them, cattle lowing in distant fields, the soft nicker of horses, the whisper of wind through the oak trees that had witnessed 3 generations of Vance family history. And inside this small room, 2 people who'd each thought their chances for happiness had passed them by began to believe that perhaps the heart was more resilient than either had dared to hope. The storm arrived without warning on Saturday evening, sweeping across the Oklahoma plains with the sudden violence that made frontier life both beautiful and treacherous. Lila felt it building in her bones before the first clouds appeared, a restless energy that made the baby kick and her skin prickle with electricity. She'd grown up reading weather signs like scripture, understanding that survival often depended on recognizing nature's moods before they turned deadly. "Mama, the sky looks green," Emma observed from the bedroom window where she'd been reading aloud to help pass the long hours of bed rest. Her 8-year-old voice carried the particular tone children used when they sensed adult concern beneath. Surface calm. Lila struggled to sit up, peering past her daughter toward the western horizon where bruised clouds were building into towering thunderheads that seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself. The air had gone still, with that peculiar quality that preceded the worst storms, and she could see Grayson's ranch hands moving with urgent purpose as they secured equipment and drove cattle toward shelter. "Where's Samuel?" she asked, fighting. The urge to get up and take charge of preparations herself, in the barn with Mr. Grayson looking at the new colt. Emma moved away from the window as the first rumble of thunder rolled across the land like a giant's bowling ball. Should I go get him? Before Lila could answer, the front door burst open, and Grayson's voice filled the small house with calm authority. Ladies, we're about to have some serious weather. Emma, I need you to help your mother gather what you might need if we have to move to the root cellar. The root cellar. Lila's stomach clenched with more than pregnancy discomfort. The underground shelter behind the main house was solid enough to withstand anything nature could throw at it. But the thought of descending those steep stone steps in her condition made her head spin. Grayson appeared in the bedroom doorway with Samuel at his side, both of them slightly damp from the first fat raindrops that preceded the storm's fury. How are you feeling? Can you walk if we need to get to shelter? The wind picked up with sudden ferocity, rattling the windows and sending loose objects tumbling across the yard. Through the glass, Lila could see the storm lantern hanging on the porch hook swinging wildly, its steady flame somehow maintaining courage against the chaos building around them. That lantern had guided countless travelers to safety over the years, a beacon of hope and guidance through troubled times. All right, that's our signal, Grayson decided, as a particularly vicious gust shook the entire house. We're moving to the cellar now before this gets worse. He helped Lila to her feet with gentle efficiency, one arm supporting her weight while Emma gathered their few essentials, blankets, water, the small tin of crackers Lila kept beside her bed. Samuel pressed close to his mother's side, his earlier excitement about the storm giving way to the instinctive fear all creatures felt when nature showed its teeth. The journey to the root cellar became an odyssey of 50 yards. Wind-driven rain lashed at them with stinging force, and Lila found herself leaning heavily on Grayson's strength as they made their way across ground that seemed to shift and slide beneath their feet. The storm lantern, retrieved by one of the ranch hands, bobbed ahead of them like a will-o'-the-wisp, leading them to sanctuary. The cellar itself was more comfortable than Lila had expected, lined with stone and timber, supplied with emergency provisions, and large enough to accommodate the small group that had gathered there. Besides themselves, Mrs. Patterson and her daughter Mary had taken shelter, along with two of the younger ranch hands who'd been caught too far from the bunkhouse when the storm struck. Well, this is cozy, Mrs. Patterson observed with the dry humor that had carried her through decades of frontier living. She was arranging blankets and supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd weathered more than her share of emergencies. Above them, the storm unleashed its full fury. Wind howled around the cellar's entrance like a living thing seeking to devour everything in its path. Thunder crashed so close and loud that it seemed the very earth was splitting apart, and between the thunderclaps they could hear the ominous sound of things breaking, tree branches, roof shingles, perhaps entire structures giving way to forces beyond human resistance. Samuel crawled into Lila's lap, despite her pregnancy, seeking the comfort of familiar arms in the face of nature's violence. Emma sat pressed against her other side, trying to maintain her usual composure, but unable to hide the tremor in her hands when particularly vicious thunder shook the world above them. "Tell us a story, Mama," Samuel whispered against her shoulder, "like you used to when Papa was alive." The request caught her off guard, bringing back memories of evenings when Robert would handle the outside chores while she settled the children for sleep with tales of brave knights and clever princesses. Those stories had always ended with families, safe and troubles resolved, fairy tale certainties that real life rarely provided. "I don't know if I remember any good ones," she began, but Grayson's voice interrupted gently. "What about the story of the pioneer family who built their cabin in a valley where three creeks met?" His suggestion carried the cadence of someone who'd heard such tales before, probably from his own parents during childhood storms. They were far from any town, with just their courage and their love for each other to see them through the hardest winter anyone could remember, As he spoke, weaving a tale of survival and determination that felt both fantastical and deeply familiar, Lila found herself watching his face in the lantern's golden glow. Here was a man who understood that sometimes the greatest act of protection was offering hope when fear threatened to overwhelm, who knew that stories could be shelters as real as stone walls and timber beams. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, perhaps responding to the storm's energy or her own elevated heartbeat. Without thinking, she placed her hand over the spot where tiny feet pressed against her ribs and was surprised when Grayson's larger hand settled gently over hers. "Easy, little one," he murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear it. "Above the storm's fury, you're safe here. We all are." In that moment, surrounded by the crash of thunder and the warmth of unexpected fellowship, Lila realized that safety wasn't just about weathering the immediate crisis. It was about finding people who would sit with you in the darkness, who would share their stories and their strength until the storm passed and morning came again. The wind continued to howl above them, but down in their small underground sanctuary, guided by the steady light of the storm lantern and warmed by the presence of those who cared, Lila began to believe that perhaps some shelters were stronger than any structure, built not of stone and timber, but of human kindness and the courage to love despite uncertainty. The storm had left its mark on more than just the landscape. As Lila slowly recovered from their night in the root cellar, news began filtering in from town about the broader damage. Roofs torn away, crops flattened, and several businesses facing ruin from the combination of wind and flooding. What she hadn't expected was the letter that arrived with Tuesday's mail, bearing the official seal of the Farmers' Trust Bank and carrying news that made Clayton Webb's debt collection seem like a minor inconvenience. Grayson found her sitting. At the kitchen table, the letter spread before her like evidence of some terrible crime, her face pale as winter sky. He'd been checking on her more frequently since the storm, officially concerned about her medical condition, but increasingly unable to hide his deeper worry for her well-being. "What is it?" He settled into the chair across from her, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the letter toward him. "Read it," she said quietly. "I need someone else to tell me if I'm understanding this correctly." The letterhead was impressive, heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind of formal correspondence that banks used when they wanted to emphasize their institutional power. But as Grayson read the contents, his expression grew increasingly grim. "They're hauling in all outstanding loans," he said finally, setting the letter down with careful precision. "Immediate payment required within 10 days, or they'll begin seizing assets to cover debts." "Not just mine," Lila clarified, her voice hollow. "Everyone who owes them money. The storm damage in Oklahoma City has apparently put them in a precarious position, and they're liquidating everything they can to stay solvent." The implications hit Grayson like a physical blow. Webb's original demand for $600 had been manageable if painful, but the bank's new terms included additional penalties, administrative fees, and accelerated interest that brought the total to over $900, due within 10 days. "This is impossible," he said, though they both knew that impossible debts were often the most legally binding kind. "They can't have the authority to change terms like this." According to their lawyers, the original loan documents included provisions for accelerated payment in case of the bank's financial difficulties. Lila's laugh held no humor. "Robert probably never read that section carefully. I certainly never knew it existed." Through the kitchen window, they could see the damage the storm had wrought on the ranch itself, a barn roof that would need extensive repairs, fencing that had been flattened, and several head of cattle that had wandered off during the chaos and were still missing. Even for a man of Grayson's means, the timing couldn't have been worse. "I've been doing calculations," Lila continued, pulling out a sheet of paper covered with her careful figures. "Even if I could work full-time immediately, even if you paid, Me double wages. There's no way to raise that kind of money in 10 days. And that's assuming Dr. Patterson would clear me for normal activities, which he won't. Grayson studied her calculations, noting the meticulous way she'd explored every possible option. She'd even included the potential value of selling her few remaining possessions. Robert's tools, her mother's china, the jewelry box that represented the last tangible connection to her previous life. "What about my offer?" he asked carefully. "To help with the debt? $900, Grayson." She met his eyes across the table, and he saw something he'd never seen there before, not just fear, but defeat. "That's more than most people see in 2 years. Even if you had that kind of money readily available, which the storm damage suggests you might not, I couldn't accept it. That's not borrowing from a friend, it's something else entirely." Something else entirely. They both understood what she meant, though neither was ready to speak it aloud. $900 was the kind of debt that bound people together permanently, that transformed relationships from choice into obligation. It was the kind of help that created dependencies. Neither of them had bargained for when their arrangement began. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion, and Emma's voice called out, "Mamai, Mr. Henderson from the bank is here to see you." Lila and Grayson exchanged glances. Henderson was the local banker, a man they'd both known for years. But his appearance at the ranch could only mean one thing. Word of the farmers' trust situation had reached Millfield, and the ripple effects were beginning to spread. "Send him in, sweetheart," Lila called, then turned to Grayson with resignation. "Whatever this is, it's probably going to make things worse." Henderson entered looking every bit as grim as his mission suggested. He was a small, neat man who'd built his reputation on conservative lending and community investment, but the lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "Mrs. Monroe, Mr. Vance," he greeted them formally, then seemed to struggle with how to begin. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news about the current banking situation." "We've heard about Farmers Trust calling in their loans," Grayson said. "Is that affecting Millfield Bank as well?" "Indirectly, yes." Henderson settled his hat carefully on the table, buying time with the gesture. "Several of our largest depositors have withdrawn their funds to cover obligations to other institutions. We're facing a liquidity crisis that's forcing us to reassess our own loan portfolio." The euphemism hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, carrying implications that made Lila's stomach clench. "What does that mean for the ranch?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Mr. Vance, I'm very sorry, but we're going to need you to bring your property loan current within 30 days. The full balance, plus any outstanding interest." Grayson went very still. "How much are we talking about, James?" $1,400. Henderson's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know it's an impossible situation, Grayson. If there were any other way..." $1,400. Combined with Lila's debt, they were looking at over $2,000 due in less than a month. More money than most families would see in 5 years of honest work. The number sat between them like a tombstone, marking the death of possibilities they'd barely begun to explore. "The storm damage alone will cost me $800 to repair," Grayson said quietly. "Even if I sold every head of cattle on the place, I couldn't raise that kind of cash quickly. What happens if we can't pay?" Lila asked, though she dreaded the answer. Henderson looked as miserable as a man delivering his own death sentence. "Foreclosure proceedings for both properties. The bank would take possession and sell everything to recover what they can after." Henderson left. Lila and Grayson sat in silence, each lost in contemplation of a future that had suddenly become as bleak as winter sky. Outside, the damage from the storm served as physical reminder of how quickly circumstances could change, how even the strongest structures could be torn apart by forces beyond human control. "I'm sorry," Lila said finally. "If I hadn't brought my problems here..." "Don't." Grayson's interruption was gentle but firm. "We're in this together now, whatever happens. That's what people do when they care about each other. They face the storms as partners. Partners. The word carried weight beyond friendship, beyond employer and employee, beyond even the growing attraction they'd begun to acknowledge. It suggested a future built on shared burdens and mutual support, if they could find a way to survive the present crisis. But as evening shadows lengthened across the damaged ranch, both of them wondered whether love alone would be enough to overcome the mathematical certainty of financial ruin that surrounded them like floodwater, rising toward the levees of hope. The discovery came by accident, as the most life-changing revelations often do. While searching for additional insurance papers in Grayson's office to help calculate their total financial obligations, Lila knocked over a small wooden box that had been tucked behind a stack of ledgers. As the contents scattered across the floor, her eye caught the cream-colored stationery and feminine handwriting that could only belong to one person. Catherine's letters. She knelt carefully to gather the scattered papers, her pregnant belly making the task awkward, but her conscience warred with curiosity as she glimpsed fragments of intimate correspondence. She should return them to the box without reading, respect the privacy of a dead woman's words to her husband. But one particular envelope, sealed but never opened, bore a date that made her hands still with shock. January 15th, 1931. 2 weeks after Catherine's death, according to the headstone Lila had glimpsed during her walks around the property. Someone had delivered this letter after Catherine was already gone. Lila? Grayson's voice from the doorway made her startle. He'd returned early from his morning rounds, probably to check on her condition, as he'd been doing with increasing frequency. "What are you—" His words died as he saw the scattered letters, the expression on her face. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, struggling to her feet. "I was looking for the insurance documents, and I accidentally knocked over this box. I wasn't trying to pry, I promise." But Grayson's attention had focused on the unopened envelope in her hands, and the color drained from his face as he recognized it. "Where did you find that?" It was with the others. She held it out to him, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he took it. "Grayson, it's dated after she died. Who would have sent this?" He sank into his desk chair, turning the envelope over as if it might reveal its secrets without being opened. "Dr. Patterson," he said quietly. "He told me Catherine had left something for me, to be delivered if she didn't survive the birth, but I couldn't face it then. Asked him to keep it, said I'd come for it when I was ready, and you never went back for it. I thought I'd never be ready." His thumb traced over Catherine's familiar handwriting. 5 years, and I couldn't bring myself to read her final words. Seemed like opening it would make her death feel final somehow. Lila moved to the window, giving him space for whatever emotions the letter might bring. Outside she could see Emma and Samuel playing with the barn kittens, their laughter carrying on the autumn air like music from another, simpler world. The sight reminded her that life continued its forward motion, regardless of the ghosts that haunted the living. The sound of tearing paper made her turn back. Grayson had opened the envelope with the careful precision of someone handling something precious and fragile. As he unfolded the letter, Lila caught a glimpse of pages covered in Catherine's flowing script, more words than a dying woman should have had strength to write. She watched his face as he read, seeing surprise replace sorrow, confusion give way to something that looked almost like relief. When he finished, he sat for a long moment in silence, the letter resting on his knees like a judgment rendered from beyond the grave. "What does it say?" she asked gently, though she wasn't sure she had the right to know. "She knew," he said, his voice wonderstruck. "She knew she was dying, and she wanted me to find love again." He looked up at Lila with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time. "She writes about hoping I'll find someone who can give me the family we dreamed of, someone who'll fill this house with the children's laughter she couldn't provide." The words hit Lila like a physical blow. "So when you helped me at the auction, I thought I was honoring her memory by showing kindness to someone in need." His admission came out in a rush, as if the truth had been dammed up for too long. But Catherine writes about more than just kindness, Lila. She describes the kind of woman she hopes I'll find, someone strong enough to handle frontier life, gentle enough to love other people's children as her own, brave enough to build something new from the ashes of loss. Lila's legs felt suddenly weak, and she gripped the window frame for support. "You're saying you chose me because I fit some description in a letter?" "No." He stood, moving toward her with the letter still in his hands. "I'm saying that Catherine somehow knew what I'd need to heal, and she gave me permission to find it. But my feelings for you, what's growing between us, that's real, Lila. That has nothing to do with anyone's expectations but our own. How can I be sure?" The question came out rougher than she'd intended, colored by all the times she'd trusted too easily and paid the price. "How can I know if you care for me, or if you're just following instructions from a dead woman? Because of this." He handed her the letter, his fingers brushing hers as she took it. "Read the last page." Her eyes found the passage he meant, Catherine's handwriting growing weaker but more urgent as she approached the end. "My darling husband, I know you'll blame yourself for not saving me, for not being enough, but I need you to understand. My death is not your failure, just as my love for you was not your obligation. Promise me you won't spend your life paying penance for circumstances beyond your control. Promise me you'll choose happiness when it's offered, even if it comes in a form neither of us expected." The letter blurred as tears filled Lila's eyes. She was releasing you from guilt, not matchmaking. "Exactly." Grayson's voice was soft, but certain. "She was telling me to live, not just exist. To love again when love found me, instead of turning away from it out of misplaced loyalty to the past." Lila sank into the chair beside his desk, the letter trembling in her hands. "I feel like I've been competing with a ghost this whole time, wondering if I could ever measure up to your perfect first wife." Catherine wasn't perfect. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. She was wonderful and bright and full of dreams, but she hated cooking, couldn't sew a straight seam to save her life, and had absolutely no patience for the practical details of running a household. We loved each other deeply, but we weren't perfect partners. And you think we could be? I think we already are in ways that matter. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his weathered ones. "You've made this house feel like a home again, made me remember what it's like to have someone to share the daily burdens and small joys with. You've shown me that loving again doesn't diminish what I had with Catherine. It honors it by proving that the heart has room for more than one great love. The hidden last will and testament," for that's what Catherine's letter truly was, lay between them like a bridge connecting past and future. In giving Grayson permission to love again, she'd also given Lila permission to stop feeling like an intruder in another woman's life. "The debt," Lila said suddenly, remembering the financial crisis that had driven her to search for insurance papers in the first place. "Even with Catherine's blessing, we still have $2,000 we can't pay." "Then we'll face that together too," Grayson said firmly. "Whatever happens, we'll meet it as partners, not as separate people carrying separate burdens." As if summoned by their need for hope, Emma's voice drifted through the window. "Mama, come see! Samuel taught the kitten to sit like a dog." Life calling to life, demanding that they step out of the shadows of the past and into whatever future they had the courage to build together. The labor pains began at dawn on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks before Dr. Patterson had predicted, and on the same day, Clayton Webb was scheduled to return for his final debt collection. Lila woke to a tightening sensation across her belly that felt different from the false alarm she'd experienced over the past month. Deeper, more insistent, carrying the unmistakable message that her body had decided it was time, regardless of external circumstances. "Grayson," she called softly, knowing he'd be in the kitchen starting his morning coffee. Within moments, his boots sounded on the wooden floor, and he appeared in her doorway with the alert expression of someone who'd learned to read the subtle signs of crisis. "The baby?" "I think so." Another contraction built slowly, making her grip the bedsheet until her knuckles went white. They're coming regular now, about 10 minutes apart. He was already moving, his practical nature taking charge of logistics while she focused on breathing through the pain. I'll send one of the hands for Dr. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson. Emma can take Samuel to the main house while we get things ready here. No. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Not Mrs. Henderson. Send for Mrs. Patterson and her daughter Mary, and ask if any of the other ranch wives can come. Women I trust. The exclusion of Mrs. Henderson was deliberate. The banker's wife had made her disapproval of their arrangement clear enough at church, and Lila wouldn't have that woman's judgment in the room while she was at her most vulnerable. Childbirth was intimate and dangerous enough without adding social hostility to the mix. As word spread through the small ranch community, Lila was surprised by the response. Within 2 hours, her small bedroom had become a gathering place for women who might whisper about her situation in other circumstances, but who set aside gossip when faced with the ancient ritual of bringing new life into the world. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her medical knowledge and calm efficiency, followed by Mary with armloads of clean linens. Tom Garrett's wife, Sarah, appeared with soup and bread, her earlier husband's rude comments apparently forgotten in the face of female solidarity. "Where's Dr. Patterson?" Lila asked between contractions, noting that the pains were coming closer together now, giving her less time to rest between waves. "Storm took out the bridge on Miller's Creek," Mrs. Patterson explained, checking Lila's progress with practiced hands. "He's trying to find another route, but it could be hours before he gets through." Hours. The baby wasn't going to wait hours. Lila could feel the child's urgent descent, the way her body was opening and preparing whether she felt ready or not. Emma sat quietly in the corner, having refused to leave despite Grayson's gentle suggestions that she might be more comfortable elsewhere. At 8 years old, she was approaching an age where witnessing birth might be educational rather than traumatic, and her steady presence provided comfort to her mother. "Tell me about the baby blanket," Lila gasped during a brief respite between contractions. The soft blue blanket lay folded on the dresser, hand-stitched by Mrs. Patterson's daughter Mary, with the careful attention that rural women brought to preparing for new life. Each tiny stitch represented hope, the belief that this child would live and thrive despite being born into uncertain circumstances. "Made it from cotton grown right here in Oklahoma," Mary said proudly, smoothing the delicate fabric. "Mama taught me the pattern. It's the same one she used for all her babies." The talk of babies and patterns helped distract Lila from the building intensity of her labor, but the distraction became impossible to maintain as the contractions grew stronger and closer together. She found herself gripping Sarah Garrett's hand on one side and Mrs. Patterson's on the other, drawing strength from the circle of women who'd gathered to support her through this ancient trial. "I can see the head," Mrs. Patterson announced with satisfaction. "Just a few more pushes, Lila. Your baby's almost here." In the main room, Lila could hear the rumble of male voices, Grayson pacing and probably wearing a path in the wooden floor, the ranch hands offering awkward comfort, and unfortunately, the arrival of Clayton Webb demanding payment that couldn't be delayed for something as inconvenient as childbirth. "Mrs. Monroe," Webb's voice carried through the thin walls with its characteristic lack of sympathy. "I'm afraid I can't extend the deadline, regardless of your current situation. The debt is due today, or I'll have to begin seizure proceedings." "Get him out of here," Sarah Garrett hissed, with the protective fury that women showed when one of their own was threatened. "Man has no business conducting collection business while a woman's in labor." But Lila barely heard the argument building. In the next room, her world had narrowed to the overwhelming need to push, to work with her body's demands, and help her child make the journey from the safe darkness of the womb into the bright uncertainty of the world outside. "That's it," Mrs. Patterson encouraged. "One more big push, and we'll have this baby." The final contraction built like a wave, gathering strength from the depths of the ocean, carrying with it every ounce of effort Lila possessed. She pushed with the desperate intensity of someone fighting for two lives, and suddenly the pressure released in a rush of relief so profound it left her gasping. The baby's first cry filled the room like music, strong and indignant and absolutely perfect. Mrs. Patterson lifted the squirming infant, checking quickly to ensure all was well, before placing the child on Lila's chest. "A son," she announced with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Healthy and whole, with good, strong lungs. Robert's son, the child they'd dreamed of but that Robert would never hold." Lila touched the baby's tiny fingers, marveling at the perfect miniature nails and the way he gripped her finger with surprising strength. Here was the future made manifest, the hope that had sustained her through months of struggle and uncertainty. "He's beautiful," Emma whispered, moving closer to examine her new brother with the careful reverence children showed toward babies. "What will we call him?" "James," Lila said without hesitation, after his father's middle name and Dr. Patterson, who's helped us so much. From the main room came the sound of raised voices as Grayson apparently reached the end of his patience, with Webb's insistence on conducting business during a family crisis. But in the bedroom, surrounded by women who'd set aside their differences to help bring new life safely into the world, Lila felt a peace she hadn't known in months. Baby James, wrapped in his soft blue blanket and cradled against his mother's heart, represented more than just the successful completion of pregnancy. He was proof that love could create something beautiful, even in the midst of loss and uncertainty, that hope could take physical form and demand a place in the world regardless of what practical difficulties surrounded his arrival. The debt collector could wait. The banks could pursue their legal remedies. The future remained as uncertain as ever, but holding her newborn son, while surrounded by women who'd chosen compassion over judgment, Lila felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the fierce protectiveness that only motherhood could provide. The confrontation that would determine their future began in the main room of their small quarters, while Lila rested with baby James sleeping against her chest. Through the bedroom door, she could hear Grayson's voice rising with controlled anger as he faced down Clayton Webb, whose persistence in pursuing debt collection during childbirth had finally pushed even the most patient man past his limits. "You have exactly 5 minutes to conduct your business and leave this property," Grayson was saying, his tone carrying the quiet authority that made grown men step carefully. "A woman has just given birth, and your presence here is both inappropriate and unwelcome. The law doesn't recognize childbirth as grounds for debt forgiveness," Webb replied, with his characteristic lack of human feeling. "Mrs. Monroe has had ample time to arrange payment. The debt is due today in full, or I begin seizure proceedings immediately." Lila carefully transferred baby James to Emma's eager arms and struggled to her feet, ignoring the weakness that followed labor and the protest from muscles that had just completed the hardest work of their lives. Mrs. Patterson moved to support her, but Lila shook her head with gentle determination. "This is my debt," she said quietly. "I need to face it myself." When she appeared in the doorway of the main room, the argument stopped abruptly. Webb looked uncomfortable for the first time since she'd known him, apparently possessing enough human decency to be discomfited by demanding money from a woman who'd given birth less than an hour earlier. Grayson moved immediately to her side, his protective instincts obvious in the way he positioned himself between her and the debt collector. "Mrs. Monroe," Webb began, his tone slightly less aggressive than usual, "I trust your situation concluded successfully. My son is healthy, thank you for asking." Lila's voice carried a steel that hadn't been there before, forged in the crucible of labor and tempered by the fierce protectiveness that came with new motherhood. "Now let's discuss this debt that apparently couldn't wait for a decent interval. The terms are simple," Webb said, consulting his papers with renewed confidence now that they were discussing business. $947 due today, or I begin legal proceedings to seize any assets held in your name." "What assets?" Lila gestured around their modest quarters. "As you can see, Mr. Webb, I possess nothing of value beyond the clothes on my back and the children who depend on me. There's also the matter of wage garnishment. Any employment income can be claimed until the debt is satisfied. Then garnish my wages," she said simply. "Take whatever percentage the law allows. I'll work and pay what I can for as long as it takes." Webb's expression soured. "At your current wages, that would take approximately 15 years, assuming no additional interest or penalties. The bank isn't interested in such prolonged collection efforts." It was then that Reverend Matthews arrived, drawn by word of the birth and the crisis surrounding it. The elderly minister had baptized both Emma and Samuel, had officiated at Robert's funeral, and had watched Lila's struggles with the patient, concern that made him beloved throughout the community. "Mr. Webb," he greeted the debt collector with cool politeness, before turning to embrace Lila gently. "My dear, I came as soon as I heard about the baby. How are you feeling?" "Stronger than I expected," she replied honestly, surprised to find it was true. Something about holding her newborn son, about successfully bringing new life into the world despite all the forces arrayed against her, had filled her with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. "Perhaps I might have a word about Mrs. Monroe's situation," Reverend Matthews suggested to Webb, his tone carrying the moral authority that came with decades of spiritual leadership. "I understand there are debts involved, but surely some accommodation can be made for a woman who's just given birth." "The law is the law, Reverend. Sentiment doesn't alter legal obligations, nor does heartlessness improve legal standing," came a voice from the doorway. Tom Garrett entered, followed by several other men from town, ranchers, farmers, even Mr. Henderson from the local bank. Behind them came their wives, the same women who'd helped with the birth now returning with their husbands in tow. "What's this about?" Webb demanded, clearly uncomfortable with the growing crowd. "Community meeting," Garrett replied, though his tone was significantly more respectful than it had been during their church encounter. "We've been talking about Mrs. Monroe's situation, and we've reached a decision." Sarah Garrett stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box that clinked softly with the sound of coins. "We've taken up a collection," she announced. $53.47. It's not much, but it's a start. "I organized a quilting circle," added Mrs. Patterson. "We can sell our work to raise more funds." "The men's fellowship at church voted to contribute from our building fund," Reverend Matthews added. "Another $100. One by one, members of the community stepped forward with contributions, money, pledges of work, offers to help in whatever way they could. Even Henderson, who delivered the crushing news about the bank's own demands, quietly pressed an envelope into Lila's hands. "What's this?" she asked, though her voice was thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "Payment in advance for household management services," he said gruffly. "My wife's been after me to find someone to help organize our home office. 6 months' wages paid up front." Webb watched this display of community support with obvious bewilderment, as if he'd never encountered people who would rally around someone in need rather than simply shrugging and walking away. "This is all very touching," he said finally. "But you're still several $100s short. The bank requires full payment. Then the bank can wait." Grayson's voice cut through the murmur of community voices like a blade. "Because I'm prepared to make Mrs. Monroe an offer that changes everything." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document, a marriage certificate, blank except for his signature. "Lila Monroe," he said formally, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal hung in the air like sunrise after the longest night, carrying with it the promise of legal protection, financial security, and the legitimacy that would silence gossips like Webb forever. But more than that, it carried the weight of love freely offered and hope courageously claimed. "Yes," Lila said simply, and the single word transformed everything. As Grayson's wife, her debts would become his responsibility, but more importantly, their family would become legally recognized, protected by law and community acceptance. Webb's face cycled through confusion, frustration, and finally resignation. "This doesn't change the debt obligations," he protested weakly. "Doesn't it?" Reverend Matthews stepped forward with a smile. "Mr. Vance, would you like me to perform the ceremony right now?" As the community gathered around them in their small quarters, with baby James sleeping peacefully and Emma and Samuel watching with wide-eyed wonder, Lila and Grayson joined hands to make promises that would bind them not just legally, but in the sight of God and their neighbors. The marriage certificate, simple, legal, and transformative, represented more than a solution to their financial crisis. It was a declaration that love could triumph over circumstance, that community support could overcome individual hardship, and that sometimes the bravest thing two people could do was choose to build a future together, despite all the reasons. It might not work. 6 months after baby James's dramatic arrival and their impromptu wedding ceremony, Lila stood in the kitchen of what was now truly their home, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the wide oak floors. The same kitchen where she'd once prepared meals as an employee now served as the heart of a family that had grown and flourished beyond anything she dared to hope during those desperate days at the county auction. James, now a sturdy 6-month-old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin, sat in the wooden high chair that Grayson had crafted during the winter months, banging a spoon against his feeding tray with the concentrated enthusiasm that babies brought to their exploration of the world. The sound echoed through the house like a drumbeat of contentment, mixing with Emma's patient voice as she helped Samuel with his morning lessons at the kitchen table. "Mama?" James dropped his spoon again, Samuel announced with the 8-year-old's mixture of exasperation and affection that had characterized his relationship with his baby brother from the beginning. "Then pick it up for him, sweetheart," Lila replied, her hands busy with preparing Grayson's breakfast. "He's still learning how to hold things properly." The routine had become as natural as breathing, this rhythm of family life that encompassed everything from Samuel's boundless energy to Emma's growing maturity, to James's innocent demands for attention. Even Grayson had settled into his role as father and husband with the same steady competence he brought to ranch management, though Lila sometimes caught him watching the children with an expression of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe. His house had filled with the laughter Catherine had hoped he'd find. The sound of boots on the porch announced his return from the morning livestock check, and Lila felt the familiar flutter of happiness that still surprised her with its intensity. 6 months of marriage had not diminished the quiet joy she found in his daily presence, in the way he kissed her forehead each morning before heading out to work, in the gentle way he handled James during the baby's fussy evening hours. "Morning, family," he said as he entered, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. The casual possessiveness in the word family never failed to warm her heart. "James, are you giving your mama trouble already?" The baby responded with a delighted squeal and reached his chubby arms toward Grayson, who scooped him up with the confident ease of someone who discovered a natural talent for fatherhood. The sight of this strong, capable man cradling her infant son with such tender care still had the power to make Lila's throat tight with emotion. "Mr. Henderson stopped by while you were at the north pasture," she said, settling his breakfast plate before him while he balanced James on his knee. "The final payment went through without any problems. We're officially debt-free as of yesterday." The relief in his smile was genuine, though the financial crisis that had once threatened to destroy them now seemed like something from another lifetime. The community support that had rallied around them during their crisis had evolved into lasting friendships and business relationships that benefited everyone involved. Henderson's wife had indeed hired Lila to organize their household accounts. Several other families had requested similar services, and the extra income had helped them recover more quickly than anyone had expected. "What did he say about the A property expansion? Grayson asked, cutting his eggs with one hand while James tried to grab his fork with determined baby fingers. The Morrison place is definitely for sale, and he thinks we can get favorable terms on the loan. Lila settled into her own chair, noting how natural it felt to discuss business decisions as partners rather than as employer and employee. 300 acres of good grazing land, and the house could be fixed up for one of the married ranch hands. The Morrison property had come available when the elderly couple decided to move to town to be closer to their grandchildren. Adding it to the Vance Ranch would nearly double their holdings and provide room for the expansion that success had made possible. "What do you think?" Grayson asked, and Lila knew the question carried weight beyond simple business consideration. Every major decision they made now was evaluated not just for its financial wisdom, but for its impact on the family they were building together. "I think," she said carefully, "that Robert would have loved to see his children growing up on land that stretched to the horizon, with room for them to build their own dreams someday." It was the first time in months that she'd mentioned Robert without the sharp pang of guilt that had once accompanied thoughts of her first husband. Grief had softened into gentle memory, aided by Grayson's patient understanding that her past love didn't diminish her present happiness. "Papa, can I help with the horses today?" Samuel piped up from his lesson books, using the name that had evolved naturally over the winter months. The first time he'd called Grayson Papa, both adults had gone very still, but the boy had continued the conversation as if nothing momentous had occurred, and gradually the title had become as natural as breathing. "After you finish your arithmetic," Grayson replied, his tone carrying the gentle authority that had made him beloved by all three children. "Education first, then horses." Emma looked up from her own studies. She was working through a reader, intended for children 2 years older, her quick mind hungry for more challenging material. "Mama, Mrs. Patterson says there might be a new teacher coming to Millfield in the fall, someone who's been to a real college back east." The prospect of better educational opportunities for the children was another blessing that had emerged from their changed circumstances. As the wife of one of the county's most successful ranchers, Lila found that doors opened for her family that had been closed when she was a struggling widow. A soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted their breakfast conversation, and Sarah, Garrett, peered in with the comfortable familiarity of friendship that had replaced their earlier wariness. "Morning, Vance family," she called cheerfully. "Lila, I brought those curtain patterns you wanted to see, and Tom says to tell Grayson that the new bull arrived yesterday and looks even better than promised." The easy social interactions that now characterized their lives still amazed Lila sometimes. Where once she'd been the subject of gossip and speculation, she was now simply Mrs. Grayson Vance, a respected member of the community whose opinion was sought on everything from church social planning to agricultural improvements. As the day progressed with its comfortable blend of work and family time, Lila found herself thinking about the tiny leather boots that sat on the kitchen windowsill, the first shoes Grayson had crafted for baby James, made from the softest leather and sized for feet that would soon be taking their first steps across the wide porches and rolling pastures of the ranch. Those baby shoes represented more than just practical footwear. They were a symbol of the steps forward they'd all taken together, the journey from desperation to hope to love that had transformed not just their circumstances, but their very understanding of what family could mean. When evening came and the children were settled for the night, Lila and Grayson sat together on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of harvest time, the season when patient tending of the land yielded abundance, beyond what anyone had dared to plant. "No regrets?" Grayson asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the peaceful scene before them. "None," she replied, and meant it completely. "Though, if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here as your wife watching our children play in the yard of the finest ranch in 3 counties, I'd have thought you'd lost your mind." "Our children," he repeated, and she heard the wonder in his voice that still accompanied that phrase. I liked the sound of that. In the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in pastures that stretched toward a horizon bright with promise. Inside, the house, 3 children slept safely in beds that would always be theirs. And on the porch of a home, built with love and sustained by hope, 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances continued the ancient human work of building a future one day at a time. The baby's first shoes sat in their place of honor, waiting for the moment when James would take his first independent steps into a world that had been transformed by courage, community, and the unshakable belief that love could indeed conquer even the most impossible obstacles.